Hello, everyone. I'm AJ Woodhams, host of the War Books podcast, where I interview today's best authors writing about war related topics. Today, super excited to have Jeffrey Stern on the show talking about his new book, The Mercenary, A Story of Brotherhood and Terror in the Afghanistan War. Jeff is an award winning journalist and author. He's written 3 books, one of which was turned into a major motion picture by Clint Eastwood. That's really cool. His work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, Atlantic, and others. Jeff, how you doing today?
Good, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed your book. I know you say it's not a novel in the very beginning, but I really found myself reading it as if it was a novel. I really stylistically, I loved it. I thought you did a really nice job with the story, and it's like one of those books where I felt like the pages turn themselves. So really nice work.
Thank you. That means a lot. That's like everything I want to hear. So
Oh,
I
good.
appreciate
All right, perfect.
it. Can we
Well,
stop?
let me. What's that? Yeah. So thanks everyone. That's the interview. So let me just like first start on something that. So you were a war correspondent, and you write briefly about why, but you don't really dwell on it. But I kind of want to dwell on it here a little bit. So what made you want to go to Afghanistan to be a war reporter? What did your family think when you said, "Hey, I'm going to Afghanistan"? Tell us a little bit about how you got into that.
So I mean, one of the things that I thought might be one of the things I was interested in was writing, and I think that sort of in when I was in college, that was sort of a passion that grew a little bit. I didn't like I was kind of late to it in some ways. I didn't write for my college paper. I had the chance to write a few longer form articles for local kind of hippie independent paper, a free paper, my alumni magazine, an article or two. So I had just enough experience to be like, I kind of like this. And I probably thought of myself as, the next great American novelist or something, but knew didn't want to be kind of like the starving artist type, wanted to be a little bit more practical. So that I think was the bridge from writing to journalism. And then because I didn't have that many connections, I didn't have really a portfolio. It was hard for me. I tried. It was hard for me to get a job in journalism, and it was hard to prove to editors that they should consider me as a freelancer. And so somewhere along the line, the idea, and it kind of started as a joke that turned into maybe an idea that turned into, well, maybe I should actually seriously consider this, was this idea of going someplace where even if no one knew who I was, the place would kind of pitch itself in some way.
Were you afraid of the danger that you were going to be putting yourself in?
I think it was such a I don't think it was real until it was real. I
Yeah.
think for so much of the planning, there's no way this is actually going to happen. Oh, I forgot to get this kind of visa. Of course. Like, so now I'm not going to go. It wasn't until I kind of landed that it occurred to me that this might actually happen. And there were a million times along the way that it was like, yeah, see, I screwed this up. So I'm not actually going to go. Or, it was always like this kind of thing happens in the movies, doesn't happen in real life. So eventually I'm going to have the reality check and it's not going to happen. So I think that prevented me from being scared, not because I was, brave and willing to face the consequences, but because I didn't think I actually would.
It's just like it's like, well, I guess like everything's kind of worked out in this, so I guess I'll jump in and do this.
That, or a little bit also of the opposite, that not this is not all going to continue to work out. So I'm not actually going to end up in Afghanistan. I'm going
What
to end
did
up
your
in my
family What did your family say when you told them?
well, I think partially because it had started as this kind of a joke. So I'd had this internship, and one of my bosses had a friend who was the Islamabad bureau chief or the Kabul bureau chief for I think the Washington Post, and had written and said, "Hey, hey, buddy, hey, Brian, I'm coming home. I'm giving up this post." And so my boss, Brian, was like, "Oh, interesting. My friend is coming home from running the bureau, the Washington Post bureau, in it was, Kabul or Islamabad or wherever it was." And I said, "Oh, I'll take over." And it was sort of a joke because everyone knew I was kind of like the least qualified intern they'd even ever had. So it was like, ha ha ha, Jeff will take over. And then I think that sort of lodged in my head, like, what a funny joke. Well, now wait a minute, and so
Nice.
and I think I talked about it that way. So I talked about it as kind of a joke, then this sort of fantasy, then so I sort of unintentionally kind of like weaned people into the idea. So I think for them too, it was a little bit of a this is not actually going to happen until I was taking off.
Well, your book, so it's not a memoir, but it's, your life is, front and center in it. And you say, like I mentioned, it's not a novel. How would you classify your book, actually?
I'd love to classify it as a novel, actually. I mean, that's why
Okay.
I was so affirming that you said that because
Oh,
I do
great.
You know, I I work really hard to try to make things, make it read like a novel. And I don't know that necessarily all the time I take being this word instead of this word, this develop this person like a character. I don't know that necessarily always shows up on the page. So first of all, when you reflect that, it's like maybe some of that time was worth it. And
Nice.
also I find just in publishing, there's sort of a tendency to say, okay, this is nonfiction, and therefore this is here's the audience we should sort of push it to. And I am not an expert in Afghanistan. I would never claim to be, nor would I, want to be. But that's kind of the conventional path to presenting a book like this.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Jeff's an expert in Afghanistan. Talk about that. And really, what's more important to me is to sort of tell the story and some of the other more kind of human, perhaps a little bit less practical messages. So I would love to. I've thought of what to call a genre. I mean, nonfiction novel. Is that
Yeah.
is that oxymoron?
No, I've read actually, there's a nonfiction novel by Ken Follett called, I think, On the Wings of Eagles, and it's about Iran. I read this book a long time ago, so I really forget anything that was in it. But I've read books like that before. So, not that you want to, maybe that's not your style, but but the events in this book are with an asterisk, kind of, which you point out in the introduction. They're true, though, right? These aren't things that you made up.
I didn't make anything up, at least not on purpose. I, hired a fact checker. I couldn't really afford to point out all the things that I didn't really have sourced well enough. I mean, it's impossible to avoid, 100% avoid mistakes, but I tried as hard as I could to avoid them. And I suppose the exception is just that I did want to lean into misperceptions. That was a huge part of it, largely mine. So that's why you see things
Yeah.
happen, in part one of the book that are true to how I was experiencing things, but you realize later when you see things from other people's perspectives that in the moment I was confused, or I was a little naive, or I misread the situation that I was in.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that because I thought that was a very interesting, the events that you describe versus the events that your friend Aimal describes. I thought that was very interesting. Just for the audience, maybe we can just kind of step back and give some context and give an overview of your book. So it says on the cover, a story of brotherhood and terror in the Afghanistan War, and it's the story of you and your friend Aimal, and your life story, his life story, and how those stories interweave and the events that take place. Is that an accurate way to?
Yeah, that's perfect. I love that. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, great. Well, talk a little bit then about. Let's start with, so you've got the story of Aimal in your book. Talk a little bit first about your friend Aimal, his background, his personality. He seems like a really interesting guy.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about him.
So, when I first met him, he was a taxi driver, and he was really funny and really charming, and I just sort of felt like we bonded. And I didn't speak any Farsi. I he didn't he was very confident in his English, but was very bad at it. But so there was lots of laughs. There was a lot of just sort of connecting on just sort of a human level. I think looking back, part of that is because we were similar in a lot of course, very different in a lot of ways, but similar in some ways. One of which was that we were both really ambitious, and we were both really trying to make a name for ourselves. And we were doing it kind of in a similar in a similar atmosphere. I was in an entirely new country, and this was his country, but it also kind of wasn't. I mean, this was his country that looked a lot different from how it had when he was a little bit younger, because all of a sudden there was, so much money and so much international presence. So, he was sort of his streets, but also a little bit different. And also there was this part of his city that grew up that he didn't really have access to, which is where all the kind of foreigners would spend time, and the bars and the bases and all this stuff. So we became friendly. He started to really look out for me. Our sort of lives continued to intersect. We were about the same age, and then at some point he kind of shifted from this scrappy, funny, hard luck, always kind of in need kid to pretty wealthy, and then really wealthy. And of course, at the time I was very confused and couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And it was only years later that he sort of clued me in to what had been going on under my nose.
Yeah, and so, like, his backstory is he grew up, very, I would say, very, very poor in Afghanistan. He was not one of
Right,
the wealthier or from a
right.
wealthier family in Afghanistan. And his background was, he becomes a businessman. He starts, like, selling CDs, I think, or something to do with music, and he just, like, kinda, like, slowly works his way up, and by the time you meet him, he owns his own he drives for a taxi company, or he owns his own company?
Drives for a taxi company. He hadn't started as that, and that to him at the time felt like, as high as he could ever get, because he got to spend all this time with foreigners who he had kind of come to idolize, because earlier during the Taliban years and the Civil War years, when he was, literally starving, one of the only ways that he had sort of relief was his brother had kind of stolen a satellite dish, and he would watch, international but largely American television. So he sort of came to idolize foreigners, white people, the way he described it. He wanted to be around white people, and he wanted to be a white person. He wanted to. So when he got a job driving for this taxi company, even though he was sort of getting paid not that much, for a while it was, I have arrived. I get to spend time with foreign people. It was
And
after
so
that he started his own company.
yeah, and all the while, like, growing up, you talk a little bit about how he's like, the Afghanistan War starts, and before that, before 2001, he's watching on, like, his satellite dish. He's watching other countries, and it's kind of his escape in, like, the events going on in America or in Europe. And then September 11th obviously happens, and all of a sudden his country is on TV, and he's
Yeah,
watching his own people. I thought that was really striking. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the Afghanistan War and how that obviously that's the backdrop to this story. So you get to Afghanistan in the late 2000s. I think it's 2007.
that's right.
What was going on in the war at that time? What was going on in Afghanistan?
So I think if we look back now, that looks kind of like the beginning of really the insurgency kicking off into another kind of a higher gear. Of course, there was this period in the early 2000s where the Taliban had basically said, "Okay, we lose, we're out," and then they sort of came back. At the time, it didn't necessarily feel that way. It felt, I mean, to me, landing there, and I was probably blinkered a little bit just by the fact that I was having this crazy adventure that, again, I never thought would actually happen. And I was in this strange, but also like very beautiful place. So it didn't necessarily feel like I was parachuting into this very kinetic war zone at all. I mean, it felt like I was parachuting into a kind of beautiful, a little bit dusty, developing country with a lot of energy. But it was not, and this probably should have been a lesson, like, it wasn't that hard to find. I mean, there was some kind of violence beginning to happen, even in this major cities, several times a week. So it was sort of these two worlds happening at once. It was like, studying abroad in an interesting new safe country with friendly people, but then also this sort of undercurrent of really intense like urban insurgency happening.
And so, like, you're a young reporter. What are some of the things that you're feeling? Like, what are the thoughts you're having? How is this all registering to you as a young fresh out of college too? I don't think we mentioned that this is like your first reporting. I think your first reporting job out of college. and basically you were freelance, like you were
Really,
working at a university and
yeah.
just going around trying to get stories. What were your feelings at the time?
I think for me, I was so in a. I mean, again, I think I was able to keep this sort of facade of like this isn't quite real, and this is something that kind of came home later that I dealt with much later. But I wasn't conscious of this at the time, but I think I had a sort of clinical mindset. I am here to observe and maybe even a little more almost shamefully, like I'm here to build a career for myself. So things would happen, and I'd be conscious of sort of the tragedy and the human cost, but I would also be able to sort of see things in a I'm a journalist. How is this going to make for a good story? Who am I going to how am I going to get a really powerful detail that an editor back home might want to might be interested in?
Yeah, it becomes a
And I
little
was,
less human at
yeah, it
that
is.
point. I remember Anderson Cooper talked once about how he was reporting from a war zone and he was a little bit younger and he just found himself just like snapping photos of dead bodies or something and not even realizing this is a human being, this is a life.
Yeah,
So maybe like a
really.
similar feeling.
Yeah, it is. It's like, yes, it's a human being, but it doesn't kind of register emotionally as much. And I have a few explanations for that. I don't know which of them are true, if any. But one is, I know doctors who can go into an emergency room and take care of people who are bleeding out, but who, if they see someone roll their ankle on this sidewalk, are puking. So I think there's something of like being in situ. This is my job. This is that you're able to kind of be a little bit more clinical. I also think, and this is uncomfortable to admit, but I think that there might be an aspect of these are human beings, but they don't look exactly like me, and therefore maybe this is like I don't connect to it as much. That would be blown up for me way later when Kabul collapsed, and it was like all these people that I felt were my family were in trouble. But I think for a while I was able to sort of keep that distance, and I think another part of it may just be because as close as I came to feel to people and to this place, I always knew I had another home. And even when at times Afghanistan felt like a home, I still had another home. So I could leave.
Yeah.
It didn't quite register to me that people around me couldn't really.
And so as your fledgling reporting career, as that kind of gets off the ground, what are some of the, I guess, what are some of the things that happen on that first kind of stretch when you're in Afghanistan as a reporter?
Yeah. So first of all, you alluded to this, but I was not able to make enough money, doing a couple of articles, doing an article a week or something for, esquire.com/backslash part of the website no one ever goes to actually survive there. So I ended up getting this job at the American University of Afghanistan. It was a low level job, basically kind of a glorified secretary, but it gave me housing, a little bit of money, and kind of a base of operations. But so what would happen is I'd have a 9 to 5 or sometimes longer than that. And then if something happened, I'd sort of ask my boss, like, hey, I'm hearing there's a bomb went off in this part of the city. Can I go? And usually it would be because Amal had called me to tell me that. And usually I'd be trying to find a way to get Amal to come get me rather than, one of the other drivers for that taxi company.
I guess I've been saying I'm all. I was reading it I'm all, but Amal, like email, you say.
Well, you're saying
So
it as
am I saying
close
it?
as Amal.
Okay.
I think, yeah, I mean, and
I
that's
lived in the
another
Middle East for a very short period of time, so some of the pronunciations I can get okay. Anyway,
sometimes I think that hurts as much as it helps because it's correct in one country, and it's slightly different in another country.
sure, sure, sure.
So we covered some bombing, some shootings, there mine clearing operations. And I was sort of getting drawn into the kind of development efforts because I had this job at the American University of Afghanistan, which was partially a grantee of USAID, USAID. So of course, I wasn't by any stretch, a development expert or anything like that, but I had kind of a window into what was happening in terms of like the development efforts and the education efforts, for better or worse. So those two things were kind of happening at the same time, and it's true. I've gone back and forth to the country over the years, but that first stint was 6 or 7 months straight, which at that age and at that time felt, that felt like being there, especially because other journalists, with some exceptions, but other journalists would usually come in for, a few days or a few weeks and leave. So I was sort of like, man, I get it. I live here, after being there for 6 months.
And so you eventually return to America. How are you feeling then when you return?
I felt, I think I felt a mix of things. I felt like I'd had this kind of really meaningful experience. I had the beginnings of a portfolio. Um, I still couldn't really get a job, you know? So what ended up happening is I spent 2 or 3 months being like, I'm a sort of accomplished war correspondent because I'd had 4 articles published in blog posts, basically. Still kind of couldn't get a job. And the only place that would have me really was back in Afghanistan. I got another kind of low level job at the American University and went back and did it all again for another 6 months or 7 months.
And how did things so on your second time around, how were things different?
The, things were different in that the day job I had was a little bit more directed. I went back to start working on this um, a women's education program. So there had been this project run out of Thunderbird School of Global Management, Arizona, where they were bringing about 10 or 15 aspiring businesswomen over to Arizona to kind of combine them with mentors and run them through a modified version of this business school curriculum and then send them back. There was some connection between that school and the American University of Afghanistan, and they decided it'd be great if we could do a version of this in Afghanistan. It would sort of save money, we could reach more people. Everyone at the university was really busy with really important jobs, except for me. So, not by any virtue of my qualifications, but sort of by the opposite, this was sort of put in my lap as like figure out how to do this. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to build this, Afghan women business training program in Kabul, which I again was like totally unqualified to do, but ended up being kind of an interesting, rhyme with this my sort of night job as a journalist because I would go on these tours of local businesses and meet women doing interesting things, and then I would see sort of the other side of the country when I was at some, the site of some bombing or something.
And so all the while when you're the first time and this time, your friendship with Aimal is growing, right? Talk
Yeah.
about that friendship and how that's evolving. Because he's not just your
Yeah.
driver anymore. You guys are your friends.
Yeah. He starts as my driver. I think pretty quickly I was like, I want this person to be my friend, and I'm going to make him be my friend, even if he doesn't he doesn't want to be. He was also just my entire bureau. I mean, again, I had no access to official people. I had no resources behind me, so he became my translator, my driver, my security. Really, he was my sort of network of sources because he would kind of hear when things would happen in a way that I at the time didn't quite understand how he was able to do that. And then when we were actually kind of doing stories, he would sort of facilitate. He kind of got a sense of what information I was looking for, and was almost in some ways kind of a co-writer. So he was, this entire bureau in one person, and he was becoming, I thought, a really genuine close friend, despite the fact that we'd come from, different worlds.
Yeah, and he invited you to dinner with his family.
Yeah,
It's really not just a business relationship. You seem to be really actual good friends.
yeah.
Well, I'm not asking for spoilers, because I do like how things are laid out. But maybe if you could just talk about some of the events that you would like to share with you and Imal, and what those events were and why they are important to the story.
So like the two of the scenes that as well do I'll describe two of the scenes that we see twice. And one of them is when he is kind of courting a young woman and wants to take her on a picnic to this place called the Salang Pass, which is a couple hours from Kabul, and it's just this beautiful. kind of waterfally, whitewater, mountainous region that's really close to the city, but feels totally different because Kabul, especially in the summer, it gets really hot. It's dusty. It can be, it's kind of can get dirty. It's like any other kind of downtown city. And then a few hours away, you've got this beautiful, lush, you feel like you're in the Lord of the Rings or something. So he wanted to sort of take her out from the dusty city of Kabul and show her this good time. He invited me, and my understanding was that I was sort of the character witness because this woman was Afghan. She was born in Afghanistan, but she'd grown up. She left very young and grown up in Europe. So she was, he felt he was punching above his weight, and he needed another foreigner to kind of be there to vouch for him. So we went on this on this picnic, and it kind of ended in disaster because we basically got arrested for indecency, and hijinks ensued. And as I narrate it, I was able to use my station as an American to kind of get us out of trouble. We see that same scene again from his perspective, and we realize what actually happened, which was, in addition to everything that led up to getting arrested, which I had also misunderstood, once we did, everything I said was sort of making it worse. And Amal was actually kind of stage managing the situation to try to get me to be quiet. And then he was intentionally mistranslating what I was saying. So while I had remembered this event as, wow, everyone's going to thank me. I stood up for myself, and in this foreign land, I kind of presided over this moment and got us out of trouble. It really was the opposite. I'd made things worse, and I'd made it harder for Amal, and he sort of had ingeniously manipulated the situation to get us out safely.
Yeah,
So
and this scene too, to give a little context to it. So this is obviously Afghanistan, a conservative country, and the indecency was it was just two men and a woman, and the woman wasn't related to the two men, correct?
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
So what first let me ask you, because we touched on this earlier, but I'll ask you now about these scenes that are narrated from your perspective and then narrated from Imal's perspective. What are some of the differences in how you both perceive yourself?
Well, are I think a lot of the differences, if not almost all of them, are are my own misperceptions. Because in addition, of course, perception is subjective, but I didn't speak the language. He did. There was a lot going on in his life that I, of course, didn't know that he did. So there are there are moments where I'm just sort of bringing a level of like hubris and kind of projecting onto what's around me as if I know. And it's only once we see things from the perspective of someone who is from this country and lives here, and his entire kind of career is based on looking really closely at sort of society, that we see what I would now confidently say is the truth. Between the
Sure.
two versions, part of it is my perspective and his perspective, but part of it is the perspective of a young ambitious person who lacks humility, and the perspective and truth and almost truth, right?
Now, what I was actually really struck by was, when we get I'm all narrated from your perspective. He's this like very personable, very confident, this guy that everybody likes. When we get narrated from his perspective, you really get a lot of insecurity, and or at least I felt like insecurity. For example, he's always ruminating on how his father died at when he was very young, and like he doesn't come from wealth, and Americans are kind of these exalted people,
Mhm.
and he's just this like Afghan who doesn't really matter. Talk
Yeah.
a little bit about how, because obviously you're not in his mind, but for the purposes of the book, you are in his mind. Talk
Yeah.
about how that kind of, I don't want to say character of Imal developed, but what was that? How did you come on that process?
So I think it started because before there was ever a book, I was visiting him in Canada a few years ago, and he brought up another story that we'd done together, and he said something. We were joking about it, but he said something that kind of made me realize this actually really haunted him. This was really this stuck with him, and I think that may have been the seed of, it's important to try to tell this story from his perspective, and not just from his perspective, but sort of like the interiority, because it is really easy. And this is basically what I did, to view this person as kind of, oh, this nice guy who's kind of here to serve me, and that I think a lot of our relationship, too much of our relationship, was that. And I think from part one, that's sort of what you see, this confident, happy, lucky little guy. Nothing can hurt him. Nothing, he's, and that's partially, I think, comes from feeling, thinking really highly of him. But I think it also partially comes from not thinking of him, not thinking of him as a three-dimensional human being who is able to have, doubts and insecurities. And, I'm glad you brought that up, because in a way, I think it's kind of universal. I mean, how many people that project as really confident do you later find out are struggling with deep, deep insecurities? I mean, it's everyone. Why should it be different for him? But from my perspective, here I was in this, strange, exotic new land, and everything that was there was kind of there for me to consume. And so I hope that contrast between, the somewhat two-dimensional version of Amal that I described from my perspective, and this like very thoughtful, insecure, but also kind of brilliant person from his perspective. I hope that kind of, I'm glad that popped for you.
Yeah.
That's validating.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just, I mean, there are several scenes. There's a scene that takes place in a morgue that I thought was also especially striking. So I did really enjoy those. Now, talking about Aimal in this scene that you were talking about, where you guys are basically arrested. Now he's, if I remember correctly, the woman that you're with, is this the woman that he wants to marry?
At the time, yeah, it's
Yes.
not the one who ultimately does, but yeah.
Right, right. And now this I found, so this really, so he ultimately is dissuaded from marrying her because he doesn't have enough money, and he meets her dad and he's like, "What kind of life are you going to provide my daughter?" You talk a little bit about not just that event, but because as you mentioned, he comes into a lot of money later on. Talk about how kind of this cloud of not having much money. Talk about that, how that hangs over Imal, and then how that influences some of his actions.
Yeah. So, like you pointed out, from a really early age, he was really conscious of how much he didn't have. And in some ways, I mean, that may seem kind of obvious. Not everyone knows the entire history of Afghanistan, but with even sort of the most basic knowledge, that it's not a wealthy country. It hasn't been a wealthy country for a while, but still, even by the standards of early '90s Afghanistan, where there was civil war and then there was Taliban years, and the Taliban were, among other things, they were just not very good at governing. So there was famine, there was food shortage, and not for everyone, but for a lot of people. And because he had lost his father really young, his mother was widowed with a bunch of kids to look after, and he was just very conscious, partially because of that, partially because of what he was seeing on the satellite dish, of how much he didn't have and how small he was. Basically, he felt inadequate. There were a few early opportunities he had to provide for his family. He as a really young man, there was a small NGO that did kind of vocational training and also gave kids like groceries for their families. So he had that experience of providing, very, very modestly, but that kind of stuck with him. And then every time there was some kind of even suggestion that rhymed with that kind of inadequacy, it would kind of inflame. I mean, it would he would kind of fly off the handle. And a really good example of that is the one you brought up, where he goes to meet with the father of Fatima, of this woman that he's sort of courting, and and the father is basically saying, and my hope is you can kind of see things from both perspectives, because the father is saying, my daughter is educated, she travels, she has friends, I don't want her to marry a conservative Talib type guy. But to Amal, what's happening is he's saying, you're poor, you're not good enough for her, where's your father, where's your and it's almost like violent, the feeling of, yeah, of course, again, I'm being made to feel, small and inadequate, because I don't have a family, I don't have money, I don't have, and it inflames that sense of, so screw you guys, I'm going to do it, I'm going to find a way, and I'm going to be big enough that you're all going to be, begging me for forgiveness.
Yeah, and so then talk about like that. Well, actually, before I ask you, we're gonna come back to this in a second,
Okay.
but I was thinking about just as you were just talking, did you know about his upbringing when you were there and you were with him?
No.
So this is something you found out afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay. So at the time, like, what did you think about, his life and his upbringing and his background? Like, how did you feel as an American? What were some of those? Did you already feel like I obviously come from a much wealthier place than I'm all?
I think I was conscious of being exalted, to use your word, exalted as a foreigner, as an American, and probably not as uncomfortable with that as I should have been. I sort of enjoyed this feeling of being really special through no achievement of my own, just because, I had white skin and was from America. That was sort of enough for me to be special initially in his eyes, and it felt like in a lot of people's eyes, and I just kind of took it.
Sure.
And I sort of said, "Yes, you're welcome. I'm great because I was born in the right place."
How did you feel when you found out that, oh gosh, his background, like he comes from a very poor place?
I wasn't shocked. I mean, I think I knew enough to know. I mean, I think I knew it. Of course, I didn't assume he came from great wealth. I was always impressed with his house, but I think that's just because his mom and his brothers worked really hard and to keep this house that was in the center of Kabul. But and I and then when he would have me over for these meals, they were always, there was so much food, and I sort of assumed that was not normal, but it didn't bother me, and it didn't it and I wasn't so I wasn't sort of shocked when I found out the details of his early childhood. It kind of tracked, but also I found myself really kind of like wanting to like reach out and hug that kid,
Yeah.
and be like, it'll, you're good. You'll be okay. This is not your fault.
So talk about then this journey he that Imal begins after like, he loves this woman and wants to marry her, but like he's broke. Talk about his journey then from like, okay, like I'm tired of being broke to to wealth.
Yeah. So some of his other friends at this taxi company decide to start their own taxi company, and they invite him to be a part of it. And what he finds is they mistreat him too. They kind of look down on him too, but they also like take his ideas. And so at some point, and he says this is because I suggested it, which I don't remember, but at some point I suggest, why don't you just start your own company? And for some reason that hadn't occurred to him. I think he didn't, again, to your point, like I saw this sort of confident, mouthy kid who like could do anything. He saw like, how could I'm just Amal, I'm just some poor Afghan, how could I ever start my own business? But the way he describes it, when I was like, well, screw it, why don't you start your own? That kind of stayed with him. And eventually he kind of had a bit of a falling out with the second taxi company, decided to start his own company. At that time, I was in America. He called me and asked for an initial investment. I found a way to wire him $700, and he
I
and
thought that was a point I thought was interesting that you gave him $700 to start his company.
yeah, I don't know why that. I mean, I know that that felt like a huge amount to me, but I also knew that just in the grand scheme of starting a business, that couldn't possibly be a lot. And
And it
then
turns out that's, that does become a very minuscule amount.
it turns out but in the interim, as he began becoming successful in a way that in my part, I can't quite figure out how. And he's like, "You did this. You started this company. This is your company." Again, I was like, "All right." I don't really
Yeah.
see how $700 could do it, but I'll take it. I'll take the credit. So I guess, yeah, I mean, without giving too much away, he started a taxi company. It became more than a taxi company, and he found a way to exploit the misunderstanding, the gap between the international community and Afghans, in particular when it came to weapons.
And it's tied to the American just influx of cash, or I guess
Hmm.
it's the NATO.
Hmm.
I'm not sure what the right
Say,
terminology.
International Security Assistance Force, which I think is
Sure.
NATO plus a few. Maybe
Okay.
it's NATO minus a few, but anyway, I say NATO
But
too.
there's just this massive kind of influx of cash that Imal is, that's ultimately that's how he makes his wealth for himself. Much like a lot of other people, he finds ways to get a part of that. Talk about why, what is this? Why is there so much money pouring in? What are the types of things that people are doing with this money? Talk about kind of this cash infusion.
Yeah, like so. One of the things I was hoping the book might do is, of course, we hear about corruption in wartime contracting in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere. We hear stories all the time about how horrible it is, how much money is lost, and how much graft there is and inefficiency. And in a way, he embodies that. Like that's where he's making his hay. And so part of my hope is like, yes, but like let's get to know someone so we're rooting for that person and then find ourselves almost rooting for him to make more of this American taxpayer money. But yeah, a huge amount of money poured into the country to, and this is not an expert analysis, but it always seemed to me like the motivation behind it would alternate between, at least from the American perspective, it would be we can't let Afghanistan become a safe haven for terrorists again. And then that would feel kind of politically a little bit too self-serving. So then it would shift kind of towards we're developing this country and democratic peace. And then that would feel a little bit too Pollyannic, and then it would shift back to, but there was this massive influx, billions and billions and billions of dollars to secure and build Afghanistan. And a lot of good things were accomplished, I think, and a lot was lost and wasted.
And so so when we're talking about like graft, obviously, I'm all with the weapons stuff, but like what are the types of, is there, I don't know, are people are politicians pocketing the money? How is this affecting the country as a whole?
Yeah, it's like a version of, we talk about inequality, income inequality, and almost everywhere, but in America, for example, and it's like that there with a slightly different driver and kind of a different scale. But if you're a Western country, or if you're a neighboring country, if you're Iran or Pakistan or your country nearby, it's important. Afghanistan is sort of a chessboard. It's sort of in this, it's landlocked, but it's in the strategic place. So a lot of countries find various ways of buying influence. You want to make sure that your country is, the person who's in power, the people who are in power have good relationship and sense of obligation to your country. So that can be a country sending literal bags of cash, which the CIA has done. We've done that. I'm sure other countries have done that too, or sending goods, sending weapons, sending vehicles, sometimes sending weapons so that your side, the side you've chosen to back, can fight. And I think sometimes just sending them as sort of like, here, like us. And it was largely that Amal was able to exploit. And so, there's an example with up armored vehicles, which, are kind of expensive to ship, especially to a landlocked country. But some of the neighboring countries were giving them as part of their patronage relationships with certain warlords and leaders, often way more than those warlords and leaders actually needed. So Amal found this way to take those vehicles and then lease them for a massive, massive markup to Western security contractors. So you had this kind of crazy, odd situation where, in some cases, weapons provided by Iran were being provided to Americans and British, right at the time when President Bush was saying, Iran is the axis of evil. And yet you have, American military
Yeah,
contractors driving around with, protected by armored vehicles provided by Iran.
I thought that was very interesting when you wrote about that. I also thought it was very interesting that Aimal, when he's negotiating with these Westerners, he's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't ask for too high of a price, but I'm gonna ask for it. And like he just drops like some ludicrous number, and the Westerners are like, okay, you
Yeah.
know, we'll, we'll pay that. Like they don't even try and like negotiate with him. There's just so
Yeah.
much cash. Like nobody's really paying that much attention. And I
It was
was,
really disorienting to him. He'd be like, because he's used to bartering, and that's part of his
right.
skill, and he didn't get to because no one pushed
Yeah.
back.
That was actually the first time I went to the Middle East. That was like that was a cultural thing that I had to learn also
Right.
too, is like, that's kind of the expectation is to
Yeah.
barter things down.
I remember that I just felt uncomfortable doing that. Someone would be like, "This carpet, how much is it worth? How much do you wanna pay?" And I'd be like, "I mean, I don't make anything. I don't want to insult you." Like, "No, no, won't tell me, what is it?" And I'd say like $5. I'm like, "Oh, how could you say that for"
Yeah.
But that's how
Well,
that's part
yeah, yeah. Those parts of the book, if not resonated, at least I was like, oh yeah, that's that to use
where
your
were
words.
you? Where were you?
Well, I was a few places actually. The first time that I left the country, I was 18 years old, and I went to the West Bank. Actually, yeah, I spent a summer living in Bethlehem, and I was studying Arabic in college at the time. I was at Indiana University, and I never left the country before. But I think a little bit like what you were talking about when you were growing up. You kind of wanted to like get out and see the world, and there's much more out there, and which really drove you to writing. I too, like, I was just like dying to like go see the world and go see things.
Oh,
And I got a travel grant from this company to spend a summer in the West Bank. And
wow.
I got to practice my Arabic. I lived with a Palestinian family, which was very cool because I got like, every day was like a new
Wow.
course on Middle Eastern culture. So that was really cool. And then I went when I was in college for another summer. I went to Oman, and then when I graduated, I lived in Jordan and Qatar for a short period of time. So yeah, so I've been to a few places.
Yeah.
Definitely no war zones, but I've got like a little knowledge of Middle Eastern culture. But the bartering stuff is like totally like, and I'm still like I'm not good at
Oh,
doing
not at
that.
all.
No.
Yeah.
I never learned like there's no way I would ever make it in the Middle East trying to like wheel and deal.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
That's not an email. You need someone like him to
Exactly. Yeah. No, like and I've met those people when I've been in the Middle East. When I was in Jordan, there was this guy who, real nice guy, a professor when I was in college. He introduced me to him to for him to help me find an apartment, and for to do those things that nobody don't trust, like this Westerner from Indiana. Like I grew up in like this small rural town, and so like this guy was like he was Iraqi, and he was like he fought in Saddam's army. Like he was a big guy, and it's so funny because when I was reading your book, I assume that on the cover here is Imal on the left and you on the right. Is that?
Yep.
Well, for some reason that didn't register until like maybe 50 pages in, and I flipped back and I was like, "Oh, that must be the guy." But when I was reading your story, I was picturing this guy, this Iraqi guy who was like helping me around Jordan as like kind of this fixer, because that's who he was. And like
Yeah.
he could negotiate. He To find my apartment, he flagged some guy walking down the road, and he's like, "Hey, do you live around here?" And like they got to talking, and he's like, "You know any apartments?" And he's like, "Oh, I'll show you one now." And like they negotiated the price, and he was like talking to him. He's like, "Oh my gosh, like how could you, that's an
Yeah.
outrageous price. Like it must be much lower." And so anyway, like yeah, like that kind of culture, it's not something that comes natural to me, but I also like have met people with that kind of personality and have been so grateful for them.
Yeah, you just put your faith in you just put yourself in their hands.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about your so this we've been talking about this stretch of time now where you and Imal are, I think it's like 2011, 2012. You're in different parts of the world. He's in Afghanistan. You've returned to the US. Talk a little bit about what you've going on and how your career is changing and progressing.
Yeah, so I ended up going to graduate school for international security, international relations, and then finishing again, not really being able to get a job, and decided to really kind of bear down and try to do a book. And long story short, I ended up writing this book about a co-educational school in Afghanistan that was at that time already 2012 preparing for what looked like an imminent U.S. withdrawal. So, and after that, I began working on some more long form magazine stories and started, sort of traveling the world again.
Well, let's fast forward a little bit here then to, I guess, 2021, which is like a 10-year jump, but we've only got so much time here. Talk about your career a little bit, how it's progressed, and then talk about the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan and how that impacted you.
So, in many ways, thanks to this kind of base that Amal had helped me build, I was able to do this book. When that first book was, after I'd submitted a first draft and before it was published, I wrote to every magazine editor I could find and said, "Hey, I've got some time because I'm waiting for my book to come out because I wrote a book because my book's going to be published because I just like repeated the fact that I as shamelessly as I could." And ended up getting some assignments in various parts of the world and had a few years of covering outbreaks and different civil conflicts and wars and insurgencies. All the while, Afghanistan had been kind of my first love, I guess, but also I just become so close to so many people there. And as the Biden administration announced they weren't going to change, they were going to pull, they were going to pull troops entirely out by that August 2021. A lot of us who were friends, who were friends and family of the country, kind of like, or of communities there, started to get worried. I think I still had some kind of denial that was not actually going to happen, but better start building some pathways out just in case. The person I was most worried about was this guy who had founded this coeducational school and was a member of an ethnic and religious minority. So for a variety of reasons, he was really at risk, and also I was just very close to him and his family. So there were a few months of just kind of writing and calling different American universities and think tanks and trying to find positions for him. And actually, a lot of really positive response. I was really kind of amazed. People who were not trying to, I mean, this was before there was that moment where everyone was paying attention to Afghanistan. There was no like glory or glamour or posturing in it. There were just people who learned a little bit about this person and kind of wanted to help. Ultimately, none of that worked because his not everyone in his family had passports, not everyone had visas. The embassies were overrun already. Plus, they were sort of already operating with skeleton crews, and it just got more and more and more urgent until we came to August 2021, and city after city was falling to the Taliban. Kabul fell, and it came down to a few nights of just being up all night and sort of coordinating the family's route across Kabul using this incredible network of people who'd come together, just kind of impromptu, and some pretty influential former and active duty military who were trying to make sense of the chaos and get people across. So there was just this like very traumatic but kind of heady effort to get this one family to safety. And once that happened, we had about 5 minutes of, wow, I can't believe he's finally safe. They're finally okay. And then it was like, geez, we've just deprived this whole community of its leader. And now what? And we just rolled right into trying to get more people, especially girls from that school, out of the country. And that's an effort that just continues today.
And so at this point, you're a pretty seasoned, if you want to say seasoned, but you've reported from other war zones. I think there's a chapter where you're reporting from Yemen.
Mhm.
What are some of like the career milestones that you've passed up to this point?
The Yemen was a big one. That was a really difficult story to pull off, but again had a lot of help, and that one of the things I was trying to do with that. I guess with a lot of the stories, is try to take kind of exotic and foreign and difficult to understand, and then sometimes kind of too big to understand crises and try to render them in a kind of intimate, personal, easy to grasp way. And I certainly don't always succeed, but that's often part of the motivation of trying to find an angle in. I'd done a story in northern Iraq about ISIS siege on Kirkuk and couldn't quite figure out how to like portray that in a way that Western readers might feel connected. And the solution ended up being this one story about a guy who had an old bulletproof BMW that he drove around and saved a bunch of people. So it was like literally there's a BMW, like people know what a BMW looks like. Maybe that's the almost literal vehicle I can use to sort of transport people to this other conflict. So there's a number of things trying to do that. I'd co-written a couple of books that would kind of help pay for my habit of trying to do these, this war reporting that still was freelance. And even when I was getting compensated for it, was usually after having to put in a lot of time and effort, sort of, and money trying to figure out the logistics. And then I think one of the meaningful differences between all of those and Afghanistan was that, again, I didn't realize this at the time, was that I could always come home. And when Afghanistan collapsed and there was just this sort of incredible need from a lot of people that I either knew or were members of a community that I knew, that was just all happening like on my phone. There was no, and I didn't really realize this was the first time I couldn't leave. I wasn't there. I was already, gone, but it was just constant and everywhere. There was kind of no escape. And I think that was the first time I actually, as much as I felt like I could, empathize with people who are in the midst of some kind of violent civil conflict, I think that was the first time it really came home. And it's because I was home and there was no other place I could go to sort of escape from it.
Yeah, and you touch on this actually a little bit in the afterword of your book about war correspondence, just kind of in general. What do you think your book says about war correspondence and war reporters? What do you think the takeaway is there?
I think that, I mean, one of the things, of course I'm trying, partially because I want this to be more like a novel, even though I tried very hard to make sure it's all true and corroborated. I'm trying not to be preachy, but if there is a one message to foreign policymakers and also to people who cover foreign policy and foreign correspondence and war correspondence, it's just the benefit of humility and what happens when you lack it. And I'm sort of trying to use my, part one, myself, as an example of the damage you can cause if you aren't humble, if you don't acknowledge a little bit of what you don't know. And also, if you license yourself to just do anything under the kind of rubric of I'm a journalist and therefore no matter what I do, I'm fighting the good fight. I of course think that journalism is indispensable, that foreign reporting is really important, but I also think that we being, I think, journalists, especially freelance journalists, well, all journalists tend to have, a bit of a persecution complex, a bit of a, it's so hard for us and we're doing God's work. And therefore, whatever pain I might inflict on this person I'm interviewing is worth it because I'm informing, the public. And it's not that I necessarily always strongly disagree with that, but I think that it's worth pausing and asking the question. And I think that we don't often do that. I think we often say, "Here I am, stick the microphone in someone's face. What was it like when your family was killed?" And we don't really often think, is this necessary? Is this actually helpful? Am I, you know, a- should I be caught re-traumatizing this person? So I think it's that sort of pause and question and a little bit of introspection that I I would advise to my earlier self. And if I'm going to be so bold as to advise other journalists, is it may be that.
Wonderful. Well, Jeff, this has been a terrific interview. I could just keep going, but I know we got to wrap up. Finally, here, what are you working on next?
I'm working on so one of the big things I'm working on is a book that was already late when I started this one, but it's sort of a biography of one of the first smart bombs and trying to follow this one invention from World War II to now, and telling a number of stories that kind of intersect with the development of this bomb. That's been my I'm a couple years late on that now, but it'll
Okay.
eventually.
Well, I hope whenever you finish it, I hope you come back on, and
Well,
I'd love to talk to you about it.
yeah, like
Well, if people want to follow you, or where can people find you? Are you on social media?
yeah, I'm not that good at it, but I'm trying to sort of learn that
Join
everybody
the
look at.
club.
Yeah. Maybe easiest thing is just the website, jeffreyestern.com, if and and I'll do a tweet once every 6 months. So,
Cool.
you know.
Okay. Perfect. Well, Jeff, thanks again. Everybody, Jeffrey Eastern, The Mercenary. Go get a copy. Go check it out from your library. Read the story. Very compelling read. Read like a novel. I'll repeat that again because that was Jeff's intention, and that's what I thought it did. Yeah. So, Jeff, thanks so much.
AJ, thank you so much. This was so great. Thank you.
Thanks.